Welcome to another episode of VNture Podcast. I am Amar, and together with my glorious co-host Tauros, we talk about everything visual novel related. Today we dive deeper, once more looking into the iceberg of Tauros to truly know what makes him tick. Just a reminder, all of the titles present on the iceberg represent our taste in VNs. We defined positions on it as how easy it is for us to recommend given titles. The deeper it goes, the harder it is to recommend, especially for those inexperienced in visual novels. Without further ado, the floor, should I say ocean floor, is yours, Tauros.
Thank you, Amar. Yes. We spoke about these icebergs earlier in our first and second episodes, and at the time, I really enjoyed talking about Lucy, the eternity she wished for, The Last Birdling, Fate's Day Night, a few others. But there's plenty other visual novel titles that I really enjoyed and I would love to recommend that we didn't have time to get to. So I want to start off by talking about one title I really liked near the top called 428 Shibuya Scramble. This one is a really interesting title to me because as opposed to many other visual novels, this one's shot in live action camera shots with real life actors. It's really unique, of course, opposed to all the other animation styles of hand-drawn scenes and sprites and CGs, but there are no sprites in this one. It's shot entirely the live action crew in camera through all sorts of scenes on the city. Another unique part of it, there are 5 main characters. A lot of times the narration will only follow the one main character, but in this one you hop around between the 5 different characters. You see the day's events as they go by, and it's a very unique way of storytelling too. I talked before about a title called Abyss of the Sacrifice, where it had different main character point of views, but each of them experienced different scenes, which kind of killed the whole reason for doing this. Whereas in this, all of these characters are interacting in a 1-hour time block at a time. So if you see one of the main characters running across a plaza with a kidnapping victim in tow, then another character will see that guy and the victim running across the plaza, and he'll act in his own way. So it really makes it feel like an interconnected city, with all of these people living their own lives trying to accomplish their own goals.
Okay.
But of course, each of the characters is also going through their own stories. Like, you have one guy who is a police detective, and he gets caught up in a kidnapping case that's growing out of control. And then you have one reporter who is trying to do an emergency last day, 5 report finishes so that he can keep his boss's company alive. And then another one, you have like a man who's a biological researcher. And his story is a very withdrawn, emotional one about human connections. But still, all of these main characters get tied up in overarching plots. And then it's really cool seeing the different approaches they all take, and especially the different genres they all feel. Like I mentioned the police detective, but the reporter is a very comedic route. And then the biological researcher has a very withdrawn and introspective, darker story.
Well, I have a question though. And I think during all of your synopsis, 2 things popped into my mind. So let's dig deeper, as it were. One thing is, how would you rate? Because that's the one thing you highlighted as very unique. How would you rate the live action actors change the feel of VN? Because let's be honest, when it comes to real life locations used as a background, that's not that unique. Meaning, for example, one of the titles you talked about on your first iteration of Iceberg was Katava Shoujo. And that uses real life images as backgrounds. So, but on top of those images, you put sprites. So you interwoven the anime aesthetic with real life aesthetic, and that was used in Katava Shoujo, but it's not only there. I think it's more popular than that. But here,
like in video games too.
Fair enough.
Persona 5,
but,
World Ends With You.
Yeah, but here specifically, they went on full force. Let's go all in on live action stuff. How does that change your perspective of that visual novel? Did that enrich the experience? Was that something unique? Maybe even lost some spark because it's less of an anime-related media at that point, I guess. I would presume, at least.
No, not at all. I know there's several people who weren't really sold on the live-action, real-life shots like that, but it really grew on them as the story went along. I do think that this was a great beneficial change in design from other typical stories. I think, number one, it really gives it its own fresh take, and it really pops out when you're surfing the Steam storefront, you know? Instead of having all of the anime hand-drawn styles, you have like real actors staring at you from the logo. And you get some really dramatic shots too.
I mean, fair enough.
I also think it helps with the story, because the story, as ridiculous and as over the top as it gets, it's still grounded in real life. Mostly because it's in the same way of, say, a live-action television series. You can really feel the design inspirations 428 Shibuya Scramble took from a weekly television episodic series. Like I mentioned, all of these chapters take place in 1 hour increments, and you have to finish every character's 1 hour block before you can move on to the next quote-unquote episode of the next hour. One little thing they do that I love is that the end of every chapter, they have like a 15-second video trailer of the next one, where they have the dramatic music and they have impactful lines out of context, and you wonder, oh man, what's the action ramping up to? Exactly like the next time on 428 Shibuya Scramble sort of thing, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of another title that likes to bend the definition of visual novel. So here, and I forgot to ask. I guess majority of what you describe is live action still images, or is it moving?
Correct. The vast majority of it is still moving.
Okay.
So single shots.
Okay. Now that I established that, I just wanted to contrast that, especially given the endings you described, because it sounds so similar to how School Days did it, because they have
what did it?
School Days.
School Days is another interesting comparison. Yeah,
that's why I said this is the one that also reshapes what it means to be a visual novel, because it doesn't do that in the typical way, because the typical way when you breach the border is if you introduce too much gameplay. But School Days went on and says, I'll introduce a lot of anime, because you were watching a movie at that point. So that was a very interesting take on a subversion. But going back to Shibuya Scramble, and for my second point I wanted to address, I wanted to ask, you were talking about multiple protagonists. How does that, I say, because I am a fan of multiple perspectives. Some of the best, or maybe most remembered titles feature some sort of different perspective, not necessarily as a full experience, but partially some perspectives. How does that contribute to, for example, routing? Are there choices? Can there be choices, or they are dependent on something else entirely?
Yes, there are choices. And in fact, I really like 428 for how it handles choices because, like I mentioned, all of these characters are interacting in the same city, in the same events, in the same time period. So, if one character makes a decision, it might affect other characters. For example, there's one part where one of the characters is approached by some debt collectors, and they ask
Uh-huh.
you, hey, do you know the directions to so and so place? And, the guy looks them over, and there's a choice whether you want to give them the correct directions or send them the opposite way.
Huh.
And if you send them the right way to the correct location, then later in that 1 hour segment, the reporter is minding his business and he gets accosted by these rotten debt collectors who take him in to help pay for his boss's shady dealings he's made. And so obviously this gets him sidetracked from his main goals and he can't accomplish any of his work because he's getting harassed like this, and that's a bad ending. So what you're supposed to do is have this completely unrelated character who has no idea about any of this purposely distract the debt collectors. It's a simple example, but I mean, it's just one of the many ways that these characters really interact with each other without you even knowing. It really feels like it's a whole city and these characters are just all one part of the greater plot, you know?
Okay, fair enough. I mean, during your answer, you additionally answered another follow-up question, meaning how those, if choices exist, how do they affect multiple characters? And you explained how they have a rippling effect. But now I have another question that stems from this, what you just described. Yes, they do have rippling effect, but does that enforce order of reading? Or they are bound by limitation that the consequences are always staggered by next block?
Yes, it's like the second option where all of these 1 hour blocks feel very episodic. And so there is a start point and there is an end point, although you don't know it. And the choices you make have to get your characters to survive and reach their objectives and make it to the end point of the story. There's a lot of leeway and a lot of humorous bad ends involved if you mess up. But yeah, each ending of a 1 hour block very much feels like a stopping point. Again, reinforcing that whole live action TV series feel. So in a way, this is definitely linear, even though there's a whole bunch of stories. A whole bunch of choices and bad endings. There is an ending to 428, and you go through a lot to get there, but there is one way the story ends.
Okay.
One notable part about it before we move on to the next one is that there is a famous Japanese gaming magazine called Famitsu, and 428 was one of the few titles to get a perfect 40 out of 40 score. It took many years before this Japanese game was translated and officially released to English, but it was well worth the wait. I was really happy to read it. I think it has many funny moments, many serious moments, very emotional moments too. All in all, it was a great ride. I heartily recommend 428. Moving on to the next part of the iceberg I liked is Hatoful Boyfriend. This was a very famous visual novel way back in the early 2010s, mostly because you are a high school girl attending a high school entirely composed of pigeons. And as she goes through this very interesting setting, she finds love along the way. When it was released, this kind of made some waves on the internet and got really popular because of the ridiculous premise of you, a human girl, romancing pigeons. And it got treated as a meme, as a joke, which the VN doesn't take itself very seriously. For a lot of people, this is how they got introduced to the world of visual novels, so it did do a lot of good to the industry.
I think
it is annoying though, because you've read Hatoful Boyfriend, and you're aware that it does get serious in some
Yes.
parts. Like, even though, yes, it's the whole situation is ridiculous, like, the story really does hit you with some emotional
True.
gut punches.
True.
And it's like, there are more than a few streamers who played at it just intending to laugh. And at the end of some of the routes, you know, they're legitimately crying because of some of the parts.
Yeah. Although, I mean, when it... God damn it, how can I start it? There's multiple things I want to address. First thing first. Oh, maybe I'll start with that. Okay. I think Hatoful Boyfriend was the first title for me to realize that memes have power. Because that meme, the joke, the influence it garnered was so astounding. Like, you could achieve a lot with a well-placed meme. And again, this game being very memeable was a birthing ground for a very big reception and popularity spikes along the way.
Mm-hmm. It, you know, you could say in a way it went viral.
Yes,
you know?
Very much so. And again, it's like this internet saying, I came for memes, stayed for insert plot, insert intrigue, insert medium. Different people stayed for different reasons, but they more often than not they came for memes. That was the driving force. Let's try this meme game, and it was subversive in a lot of ways. For example, if I remember correctly, I mean, one thing is that they portrayed humans as uncivilized and pigeons as being the one that are civilized. Correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't the protagonist living in a cage? Sorry, not cage, cave.
Yes, her home was a cave out in the mountains.
Like, that's so hilarious. You cannot go more uncivilized than that.
Yeah. And that was the point, how all the birds were considered the intelligent species, and she was very grateful to be there at that high school.
Yeah, and
it was all very ridiculous, and that whole ridiculousness, the visual novel embraces. You kind of have to if you're going to have a premise of dating birds, you know.
Fair enough, but they really put their feet down and emphasize on how the protagonist is immensely stupid. Like,
yes,
that was the point. And at that time, I believe visual novels were way less popular than they are now. Even now we are niche, but back then we were way more niche. And I think the archetype of a very idiotic product was also unexplored, at the very least on the Western market. So again, another intriguing part. They were brave enough to embrace the stupidity. Because oh man, tell me if you ever encounter any piece of media that was satirical, comical, but treated itself way too serious, right?
I mean, yeah, that's kind of the point of satire, right? You have a ridiculous point of view, and then it illustrates something about the world and the opposing view, right?
Yeah.
In this case, though, it was humorous, and it was meant for everyone's entertainment, which it very much did.
Would you agree? Because that's often my response after talking about Hatoful Boyfriend. Would you agree that this is one of the easiest cells to recommend, again, for the memes, playing once? I have so little negative to tell about playing it once. I think a lot of problems starts to pop in on repeated playthroughs. But once I could blindly recommend that for almost everybody. You would have to hate the idea of reading, I think, for me to not recommend this title.
That's a good point, because there is one other aspect that I think holds Hatoful Boyfriend back is that it's intentionally made to be very amateur.
Yeah.
That's part of the charm in that you see, oh, what a ridiculous premise. Someone spent 5 minutes throwing this script together.
Yes.
And that's how it presents itself. That's how it originally was with the text and the single static image of a bird and the silly backgrounds. The whole point is that it's intended to come across as being very amateurish. But the whole surprise is that you get to know the characters, these silly little birds, and they all have a lot of character growth and you care about them and whatnot. Sure. And in fact, once you get through all the routes, one of the game's best kept secrets is its last route, where a lot of important things happen and you're taken for a very different ride than the original. And yes, for anyone who's read it, the last route is definitely the highlight of Hatoful Boyfriend. And in fact, it would be a very strong recommendation, except, like I said, a lot of the rest of the VN does rely on the reader being familiar with typical VN tropes and expectations and whatnot. So although you're right, how you could recommend it, someone could just read it for one route and check out and really enjoy what they did. There's a real treasure trove in Hatoful Boyfriend to fans who stick with it and realize that, wow, there's a lot more going underneath the surface than just this silly little prompt of a high school girl dating pigeons, you know?
I completely agree. The either famous or infamous route called BBL is the thing. It was, wow, was it good? But, like I said, I believe that there's a lot of problems on limited playthroughs because it's not the whole premise for Hatoful Boyfriend as a joke. Like I said, satirical, embracing the ridiculousness, but it's wears off rather quickly. At least it did for me. And given that is, if I remember correctly, it has 13 endings, most of which are required to be seen in order to reach that one special route.
Yes,
that's a lot of repeated jokes. Let me say
technically
like that.
13 endings. Several of them are duplicates, though.
Yes,
and the main point is that there's about 6 or maybe 7 or so. Characters routes to go through. So that's the bulk of the content. The rest is pretty breezy. But yes, you are right. There's kind of a lot of busy work and the other half of those 13 endings or so probably don't need to exist. They can just be rolled together. I think later re-releases cleaned up on this a little to make it better. But yeah, you do have a point, especially with the original release.
Yeah, I think I played the original because I remember that even the skip button wasn't functional. And that, don't get me started on that.
That's one of the things that I mentioned. It was very amateurish. And yes, the skip button was kind of only half worked.
Yeah.
I don't have the screenshot going on right now, but the English translation originally was in Unicode.
Oh, God.
Which, to anyone who's ever seen it, it is very thin lines and wide script. It usually gets used whenever involving translations from Japanese to English. It is not very readable. It's kind of a pain to read.
I get it.
But all part of the charm.
Yeah, fair enough.
Another title I want to talk about that I love discussing is Nausea. Nausea is one of my favorite visual novels, but it is pretty difficult to recommend because it's very particular in its strengths and weaknesses, and it's not everyone's cup of tea. It is a sci-fi story where you wake up in a spaceship alongside other crewmates, and you discover that some of you have been infected by nausea. And it has secretly turned some of them against humanity, and they are plotting to kill enough of the humans on the ship and take over the ship and go on to infect more worlds. But you don't know who is infected. The Nausea, of course, are trying to work together and overcome the humans and sow doubt everywhere, where the humans are trying to figure out the truth of what's going on, who can be trusted, who can't, and eliminate the bad guys. It plays out with heavy gameplay. To anyone who's familiar with the werewolf style forum games, it's just like that. To anyone who's not, basically everyone gets together and talks about who they suspect and who they trust over the course of a day. And at the end of the day, everyone votes for who they think is Nausea, infected with the virus. And so one person is chosen to be sent into cold sleep. Overnight, the Nausea can secretly meet and kill one of the good guys. And so this cycle repeats, where there's the daily trial, and then they hope to eliminate the bad guys, and the bad guys overnight can kill one of the good guys, and it keeps going until the Nausea have the advantage, or if the bad guys eliminate all of the bad guys. And so it's very gameplay heavy. You are just one person in a sea of others, ranging from anywhere from 5 characters total to about a dozen. And so you only have one voice, and the rest are computer-controlled characters, and they all have their own personalities, their own approaches to the discussions, their own retaliations, and if they hold grudges, and who they ally. It's very much a political game, where you want to survive first and foremost, and you also want to accuse the people who probably won't threaten your own safety. Because if you're part of the crew and it's your job to eliminate the bad guys, you still don't want to be singled out.
Fair.
And some people, it's like, well, you don't know for sure if they're a good guy or not, and so you kind of have to take the gamble and just, send them off into cold sleep, even if they may be innocent. Because it's very hard to determine for a fact who the bad guys are. There are some special roles. For example, someone is an engineer, where once a day they can investigate one person and find out if they're human or Nausea. You have a doctor who can perform an autopsy and tell them if they were right or wrong on the vote the night before. There's a guardian angel, too, who can protect one person from death at the hands of the bad guys. But where a lot of the interesting gameplay part comes in is that, of course, the bad guys can claim to be one of these roles too.
Okay.
And so a lot of it comes down to now you have 2 or more people saying they're the real engineer, don't trust that other guy, and they're providing intel. And again, the whole difficulty in everything comes down to who can you trust and who can't you trust. Thankfully, the protagonist and the other main character, Setsu, is looping through these constantly. So when the game reaches an end, whether the good guys win or the bad guys win, main character wakes up at the start again, but things are different. Even if it's the same people on board as they were last time, some of them might stay Nausea, there might be new Nausea partners. You can't trust it. Heck, sometimes you wake up and you're the bad guy, and you need to overthrow the ship.
Wow, okay.
It's all very different each time, and that's the appeal, is that you keep looping over and over and over, and each time you get to know some more about how to play the game, you get to learn more about how the other characters act, you get to figure out some of their tells, which, I think they might be lying, and then you get better. You also earn experience in which you could level up your own stats, like intuition to notice if people are lying, logic to enable some skills that lets you piece together when someone is lying for a fact because the rules of the game don't match up with what they're saying, charisma so that other players will listen to you more. It's modeled very much after like a real life social gathering. And part of why Nausea is so fascinating to me is because of how well defined they made so many of these aspects. They really ironed it down to the nuts and bolts and numbers and values so that this could work as a 12-player, entirely computer-controlled social game. There's a main story, too, as you're trying to figure out why you and Setsu are looping. And it's relatively short. I kind of wished they went longer because part of the story meant you had to accomplish a few custom challenges. Like, for example, one of the characters says they know more about what's letting on, and so they want you to guarantee their safety in the loop. So you have to ensure that this character survives. And sometimes you fail just because they're an unlikable character and people like voting them off early. So sometimes you have to pull your hair out at how all the other characters aren't cooperating with you, darn it. But that's part of the fun.
I mean, oh man, I have so many things to break down in what you said.
It's one of my favorites, yes.
I guess one thing that came to my mind almost immediately is you place it low on your iceberg, right?
Yes.
Based upon how hard it is to recommend. And I guess the perspective here is how hard it is to recommend it as a visual novel. I think you are aware that if you describe to me something that boils down to the anime equivalent of Among Us, I can guarantee it's an easy sell given the popularity of before mentioned title.
It's not quite Among Us.
But it
Among
shares
Us
a lot of similarities with it.
Yes, they're both social deduction games where some of the people around you can't trust, but you don't know who. And so you're trying to accomplish. In Among Us, though, it's slightly different because the crew is trying to accomplish their tasks and they're fearing for their own safety.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's close, so I mean, you do have a point. In Nausea, it's more like you have to ferret out the spies hiding within you, and they are slowly but surely chipping away at your forces. And it's very much a political game, as I mentioned. Where you're trying to make allies. You're trying to think how risky it is to trust certain individuals over others. And you're trying to balance your own safety with the safety of the crew.
Yeah, obviously, the transition... Again, let's just stick a little bit for the comparison to Among Us. Transition from being a multiplayer deduction game to a single-player deduction game allowed Gnosia to introduce story elements, because that's not something that you can easily inject into Among Us, right? But here you have a crafted story that ties it all together. Now, my question is, because obviously this is, even for my standards, teetering on the very edge of what I could consider a visual novel. How would you rate ratio? How much of it is gameplay and how much of it is visual novel? With definition of visual novel here that I'm using a pure one that has no gameplay element, right? So the VM, dialogues, trees, etc., etc.
As far as the ratio would go, if we go by terms of content, I'd say it's about 50-50 in favor of the story versus gameplay aspects. But in terms of which you'll spend more time doing, I'd say it's more 20% story, 80% gameplay.
Okay.
And that's the main reason why I can't recommend it very easily. A lot of it is gameplay. Not only that, it's a very particular style of gameplay where you are just one person among a crowd of a dozen other people. And so oftentimes you're going to be sitting back and biding your time and watching other people provide input and searching for any weakness. And when you do pipe up, you won't always have much of an effect on the other characters. Just like real life, it's not everyone can be one person on jury duty and just take control of the whole conversation. There's other people involved, and they all have their viewpoints and opinions and leadership styles. And so some people don't like that about the gameplay. I understand, because it's not as active as Among Us, where you're walking around a map and playing the little mini games. This one's very much a more logical, analytical type, where it's mostly just analyzing text.
Fair enough. I mean, now that you've given me the answer, so you said content-wise is about half, even if in terms of which part you spend more time with, I would still classify that as a visual novel without issue. Because the only concern of mine was with your description, you focused so heavily on the gameplay aspect. I was wondering how much of VN is left. But now that you've given me the answer, fair enough. I can see that. I can definitely see myself trying such a title.
Hooray, that's cool. I hope you like it. I hope you do check it out.
You know what they say. I added it to backlog, so eventually.
Yes, just among all the other hundreds of titles waiting your attention.
Yes, it's not like I'm...
that's how it goes.
It's not like I'm adding more than I'm reading. Totally.
Yes, so Nausea is definitely one of my favorites. It's borderline a visual novel. Some would consider it more of a game than a VN.
All right.
That's fair. It's still one of my favorites, though, and I still would classify it as a visual novel.
Fair. Okay.
And that is about all the time we have for my iceberg.
Yeah.
I am very happy I got to cover more of them, but there's still more titles I'd love to talk about, so that will have to wait for another episode.
Yeah, so some sort of conclusion, a finale, a final boss level of sorts. We'll see. As for now,
yes.
Let's thanks for all the listeners to listening and continue supporting us. We appreciate all the feedback we're getting, so please keep being awesome and comment in the comments. As for now, see you and goodbye.
See you next week.